May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. So Palm Sunday has always been one of the strangest liturgical days for me. We start out waving branches, and then in many churches you end with the story of Jesus' death. So in the space of just an hour, really, you move from joy, from shouts of Hosanna, from palm branches and music to the story of the cross, to Good Friday. And most of us just cannot move quite that quickly, emotionally. But theologically and symbolically, it makes sense. Jesus' triumphal entry as he comes into Jerusalem is his walk to the cross. And his coming on this colt, this foal, is intimately tied up with his identity as a servant king, not as a warrior king, not as a mighty Roman military officer, but as a servant king. We get in Philippians this very clear understanding of Jesus as a servant king. He has been emptied out, it says. Even though he is in the form of God, he chooses not to exploit that for his own glory and power, instead taking on the form of a lowly human being, emptying himself of his glory, and ultimately dying on a cross for the sake of lifting up all of humanity. He is one who serves with his power. He pours himself out in order to lift up. This story, and we get this gospel in various accounts. So our palm branches don't show up in today's account, but they do in other accounts of this story. Sometimes it's a donkey. This time it's a colt. But the colt, it goes back to Zechariah 9, where we are told that the king, the Messiah, is going to ride in on a foal. Not on a war horse, not on a mighty, amazing steed, but on an animal of peace, as our first song said. Jesus had to have known that prophecy. He had to have known that when he came in on that lowly animal, people were going to consider him a king. And yet, what kind of king? At the same time, theologians tell us, Pilate would have been riding up from the west into Judea. This is around the time of the Passover. This gospel rendition doesn't tell us this, but others do. And Pilate, historically, or the governor of Judea, who at the time was Pilate, would have come in on his war horse with all of his military regalia, with sun glinting off of those swords and off of that armor, in order not to celebrate Passover and this story of liberation from slavery, not to celebrate freedom and the central story that made up Jewish identity, but rather to make sure the people didn't take it too far. It is a show of power. It is a show of power over a conquered people. And Pilate comes in with his parade, and Jesus' parade is in direct contrast, where Pilate no doubt had soldiers, war animals. Jesus had his colt. He had his ragtag band of followers, the women, the outcasts, those who had been sick, those who had been hungry and had been fed by him. And they are calling out for him to save them, to become their king. What an extraordinary contrast. The King of Peace, the King who uses his power to serve and to lift up, versus Pilate, who uses his power to push down, to make the mighty mightier. I've read an interesting policy resolution from the ELCA Church, which is the denomination we belong to. And it talked about the church's relationship to government. It says the church is in a critical, respectful relationship with government. The church, on the one hand, respects the government's call to care for the common good, to serve the common good. And yet, governments are subject to sin, just as Rome was subject to sin. And governments need to be criticized as well when they are harmful, when they make people suffer, when their ideologies or policies are corrupt. The church stands in criticism of the government. Well, this is what Jesus is doing. Jesus is standing in criticism of Rome, which said, you worship the Roman emperor. You owe us complete allegiance, not only of earthly power, but we also get your worship. And Jesus said, no. If you try to make these people shut up, the stones know who's supposed to be worshiped. The stones will cry out. The stones will say who is king. So just as on that day, we were offered two very different understandings of power, today, we are again offered two very different understandings of power. We are offered the choice to follow corrupt power, which the world is made up of, which we can see in our homes, in our businesses, in our churches, in our governments, in world governments. We can choose to follow corrupt power that tries to make the mighty more mighty, the wealthy more wealthy, that tries to oppress. Or we can follow our servant king who seeks to lift up. We can listen to the cries of those who were on the sides of the street that day, who were hungry and longed for a king who would save them, who were spiritually thirsty and hungry and longed for a king to save them. And we can be like the corrupt religious leaders and tell them to be silent, or we can follow Jesus and seek to serve them. This Palm Sunday, we are offered a chance to begin Holy Week, to walk with Jesus to the cross. This is a time of personal reflection. It is a time to look at our own hearts and to say, yes, Jesus, Hosanna, save me. And to look at how Jesus interacted with the world, and to seek to understand the power he holds up, to seek to emulate that kind of power, to seek to be servant leaders, and to pour ourselves out in love as he did, in obedience to God as he did, not in obedience to corrupt earthly powers, but to a God who called us in Matthew 25 to feed the hungry, to care for the sick, to visit those in prison, and to welcome the stranger. May we walk with Jesus to the cross. May we celebrate a new kind of power, and may we worship the God of the poor, of the oppressed, of you and of me, of every one of us who knows that we need a Savior.